Hello everyone, welcome back to the discussion on SMITE solo builds. This is building hunters in the solo lane. Now, this is going to be a bit of a shorter episode because building hunters in the solo lane is very straightforward. There's really, as far as I've ever personally experienced, primarily only three ways in which you approach building a hunter in the solo lane and have it meet with reliable success, or quasi-reliable success. Might be a better description. The first way, and the one that I've seen probably the most often how other people build, is just building the hunter as they normally would if they were playing ADC. Basically, however you normally build your hunter, you build them the same way in the solo lane, you just happen to be in the solo lane rather than in duo. Now, just like building the mage the way you normally would, this does come at some cost in the late game where you're not really there to frontline, and for a lot of the same flaws, you're not really building any defense there, you're a ranged character just like mages typically are, with a handful of exceptions such as Hades, but you're not generally going to be, up close and melee with a hunter a lot of the time. So your support tends to be on their own, and then they die, and then you die because you're not tanky enough to serve as a secondary or backup front line. Same flaws. But with hunters, and this extends to auto attack mages to some extent, put an asterisk on this, with hunters very specifically, if you get ahead of your laning opponent and you're able to really get 3-4 levels ahead, you actually can pull off a split push and potentially win that way. Instead, while the enemy is distracted late game with stomping your team, you're split pushing one of the other lanes and possibly winning. I've seen this work a couple of times. Don't just assume you can do this. This is just something that gives hunters being built the standard way a slight edge over mages built the standard way. Now, why is this the case? Why not try the same stunt with mages when you pull ahead with mages and you build standard mage builds? Well, the issue with mages is there are two issues with mages trying to do this. The first is that obviously abilities don't affect towers and phoenixes, and most mages aren't designed to have good auto attacks. There are a handful of exceptions, like I said, Kronos, Freya, Zhonghui. They all come to mind. There are a couple of other examples, but they're all, big examples of what people think of when they think auto-attacking mage. And they could pull this off, but they're also not necessarily building standard mage build if they're pulling this off either. They're building attack speed mage, which isn't exactly standard. It is for Freya. Most of the time it's standard for Kronos. Not necessarily standard for Zhonghui. So that's kind of an exception anyways, as you're not necessarily building standard mage on those particular mages anyways to build them auto-attack based. But the second problem with mages is that it's a lot harder for them to pull ahead because they are a lot of times pretty reliant on mana, sometimes even more than their laning opponent. So all they have to do is just lose access to that mana buff one time, and they, at the very least, aren't going to be getting a huge advantage. Sure, they might be able to survive using such things as the Hourglass. Yes, that is true. But as good as the Hourglass is, it's not quite going to keep up with the pace of mana usage that most mages generally tend to go for when clearing waves, boxing, etc. Hunters don't have this flaw. Primarily, Hunters' damage comes from just their auto attacks. In fact, most hunters only use their abilities to either lock down an enemy, if they have that ability, or to clear waves. Honor, for example, he uses Impale to clear waves. Maybe he throws out a Shifting Sands to increase his damage against the laning opponent. But other than that, there's not really much else going on. Sometimes he might go for a Disperse Impale combo, maybe, or a Shifting Sands Impale combo, but you don't need to box effectively as a hunter. It's just something you would do to kind of get a few shots in or finish off an enemy or something like that. Whereas most hunters, they're usually doing some kind of mix. I'm sorry, not most hunters. Most warriors are doing some kind of mix between abilities and auto attacks pretty specifically. There are a couple of exceptions, but even Osiris, as an example, he's very heavy on the auto attacks. He still throws out a bunch of sickle strikes and flail hits. He's still throwing out a lot of those during boxing matches, and that's a lot of mana being used. Hunters don't care, or they don't necessarily care. It depends on how you box as a hunter, I guess. But the point is that hunters don't need mana quite as much as literally any other class in the game, because that's not what they're designed for. So, especially if you're building Death's Toll, should you lose your mana buff, that's not really necessarily a huge deal. It's going to hamper your wave clear a little bit potentially, but it's not like the enemy's going to try to box you after their wave is cleared anyways. And you can just back up to the tower and clear the wave from your tower line very safely. Which, while mages can imitate that as well, warriors and assassins and guardians cannot in most cases. So, at the very least, not without using mana. Let me rephrase that. So, you have this mana advantage, and if your jungler steals the enemy's mana, you're in a really strong position, because that's going to force the laning opponent to box you with auto attacks, which, as a hunter, unless you've been completely screwing your build, you're going to win that boxing match. Or unless, of course, also you've fallen very behind at that point, but 9 times out of 10 you're winning that boxing match if the enemy's capability to use abilities consistently is removed. Imagine trying to box a King Arthur with no mana, as literally any hunter. You're going to win that, right? It's the same kind of scenario. Now, because, again, hunters are rather good at taking towers, it makes also that your ability to push that advantage and split push even more effective than literally any other class in the game. So, unlike with mages building a standard mage build, hunters building a standard ADC build isn't necessarily always doomed to failure, but it's also important that you remember that this is inconsistent. This is the most inconsistent way I've found to build hunters in the solo lane. It's the most inconsistent way I've seen other people play in the solo lane. So you would have to be very confident in your jungler to try this. This might be better saved for when you're partied up with a jungler and you can communicate with them to, steal the enemy's blue buff, and that would put you in a much stronger position. Now, the primarily second way that I've discovered to build hunters in general is a really interesting build here. Now, this is rather specific, but we start with Death's Toll when I do this, and then we go right into, I forgot I don't have any build on him right now, he wasn't the one I tested this with, Devourer's Gauntlet, and then we go right into Executioner. You are going to grab the Ferocious Executioner in most cases. Maybe you have an abnormally low attack speed, and you go for the Heavy Executioner. Hou-Yi, for example, has a really low attack speed among hunters, as an example. But anyways, you're going to go for the Ferocious Executioner, you're going to go for the Devourer's Gauntlet. Let's get those stacks on there. And then you're following up with Aussie, and then you're following up with Bloodforge, and then I usually will splash in a tasty little Shifter's Shield. Sometimes I feel, if the enemy team is healing, I'll splash a Toxic Blade somewhere in there, not necessarily as the last item. This'll come in at the absolute earliest as a 4th item, depending on how much the enemy's healing. But your first 3 items always should be Death's Toll, Devourer's Gauntlet, Ferocious Executioner in that order. The order of these isn't quite as important. Bloodforge will typically come later, but if I'm not building Toxic Blade, I'm building Shifter's Shield to get myself a little bit of protections, get me the ability to actually heal up in the meantime, right? If the enemy team is unusually tanky, I'll instead splash in Chin Size. So really it comes down to 3 different options. If the enemy heals, you build Toxic Blade. If the enemy is aggressive, which most of the time they are, you grab Shifter's Shield. If the enemy team is abnormally tanky, you grab Chin Size. It's basically, that's how that is. If you imagine to yourself, well, gee, this is all about the, let me throw this on there for the increased basic attack damage. This is basically a hunter version of the lifesteal build for mages. Yeah, it is. My mouse is not set correctly. It is just the hunter version of the mage lifesteal build. It's got the exact same principle. If you're busy dealing a lot of damage and healing off of it, you're not dying. Same principle, same risks. It's just that for hunters very specifically, because they tend to play better at boxing matches than mages typically do, this tends to work conditionally slightly better on hunters. See, where lifesteal mages in the solo lane generally do better at the start of team fights because they have more victims to heal off of, hunters, in fact, have the reverse in this particular circumstance. They do better in a team fight as it winds down, and there are fewer and fewer potential attackers because hunters are really excelling at the 1v1 lifesteal situation. This actually does give hunters a bit of an advantage, specifically in the early to mid game when laning like this with the lifesteal build, because they are better at that 1v1. So as long as they don't get ganked by the enemy jungler, they're probably going to win lane with either of these first two builds. It just is the late game that you really have to watch out for, and again, building a hunter normally as if they're an ADC, but you just happen to be in solo, that's going to leave you very open to quick and easy deaths if you're not careful enough, which most hunters aren't. Let's be honest. I'm guilty of the same thing. But anyways, but the lifesteal build is a little less risky because you're still doing a pretty decent amount of damage. Not quite as much as you maybe normally build, but a respectable amount of damage, and you're healing off of that quite nicely. And that's really going to allow you to pseudo-tank while still dealing damage. So there is this as well. So basically, yes, hunters follow a lot of the same trends as mages. But here's where it gets particularly interesting. Is the tank build. See, the interesting thing about building tank on a hunter is a couple of very specific items, right? So what am I talking about? Well, first, let's go back to the beginning of the build. Of course, you build Death's Toll. And then, usually, when I'm building tank on a hunter, I will build my only damage item, well, my only primary damage item, as Chin Size immediately. It's a little bit expensive. It can be quite risky. But generally speaking, it's quite worth it. You build this first because this gives you the opportunity to make sure your laning opponent is who you think it's going to be. No point in building the wrong protections right off the top. And you want to build Chin Size anyways because Chin Size, just like Soul Reaver, the equivalent of this for the full tank mage build, that works on a percentage of health. The real catch and the reason why hunters are a bit more consistent here is because not all mages are great with abilities. And in fact, only those only those mages where all of their abilities damage the enemy really can pull off the Soul Reaver full tank build as effective, at peak efficiency. This isn't really a concern for any hunter except, no, even Chiron would be pretty good with this. But this doesn't really affect hunters because all hunters have, a good, strong auto-attack foundation. That's, part of the point of using them. So Chin Size, in this particular case, in the full tank build, in particular, is just generally more effective. Now, at this particular point, you would want to start building up your protections. How you want to build those protections is kind of up to you. It really depends on the situation for me. I'm going to assume 3 physical, 2 magical. If it's the reverse, you just reverse the order of these items. I'll generally go for physical protections. I'll either go for sovereignty. I go for contagion quite a lot, or sometimes I'll go for void shield. It really depends on the team compositions, but I think by default I'm running a lot of contagion. Just as an aside. And then my magic protections, obviously I'm building. Well, let's actually just build this out. Why not? I'll go contagion because that's my norm. Sometimes I don't build it, but a lot of the time it just happens to be contagion. Go for Shogun's Kusari, of course. Physical, either of the other 2 options that I mentioned earlier. I like Void Shield a lot of the time, not necessarily always my go-to. At this point, we're grabbing Talisman of Energy. And then you grab Death's Embrace, and basically you're healing off of that you were using that as your healing. Now, there are alternatives. You might not like Void Shield, you might not like Talisman of Energy. It is perfectly viable to go for Mantle of Discord and Spirit Robe as examples. That's also fine. It gives you more protections, not as much health, which means you heal a little less. That's potentially fine. Your attack speed is lower. That's also potentially fine. It really depends on how you play it. But these first 4 items are pretty solidly what I build all the time. It's these last 2 that tends to change according to the situation, which is pretty standard for a lot of archetypal builds. And again, this is, using the very similar principle to the mage version, really, except with the mage version, generally speaking, you can't use Vampiric Shroud for that because it's only going to heal you once per ability for 1.5 your health and mana. This is once per auto attack, and it's 2%, right? That is a much more consistent and useful self-heal than the mage equivalent. So there is that as well. And this actually I actually want to talk very seriously about building full tank on a hunter or a mage in the solo lane, because these offer a really unique advantage that I've noticed, along with a very unique risk. When you're playing solo lane, most of the time you are expected to be frontline, and in theory, building full tank is supposed to support that idea. However, I've discovered that it's often just as effective for me as a tank hunter or mage to sit in the back line with my hunter or my ADC in my mid lane and kind of just bodyguard them a lot of the time. And the enemy assassins generally don't fare well here. Because they're not really expecting a full tank hunter to be sitting there just waiting to absolutely go buck wild on the first assassin that rolls into town trying to kill their hunter slash mage, right? It's not something a lot of assassins expect. There are some assassins that simply, well, I'm sorry, I can't say assassins because one of them isn't. There are some junglers that just don't care. Ao Kuang, Achilles, Arachne, final boss of Spooky Bitches. They all just generally don't care about the, having a tanky hunter or mage back there. And you can see where only that one specific attack is actually legitimately damaging me, right? If I had, say, more of the auto attacks, right? If I had Talisman of Energy, maybe this would be going a little bit better for me, but you can see where I'm basically just stalling out life itself here, and I was just kind of doing this as to kind of exemplify. Obviously, as a solo lane, I can't take that solo, but it's fairly obvious, but that wasn't what I was trying to demonstrate. I was trying to demonstrate that you can heal impressively large amounts of damage with this build just using Death's Embrace. But just being there, just kind of chilling with your ADC in your mid lane as a tanky mage or a tanky hunter can, in fact, really surprise the enemy assassin. The only risk that's really going on here is that your guardian, or your support, I should be officially saying, your support gets killed, and you're not there to help them out. Well, they die because you're not there to help them out, which is a very legitimate risk, and that really depends on how aggressive your support is and how willing they are to back off and regroup. That's partially going to be their ability to recognize what's going on, and partially you for maybe not necessarily communicating it. So try to warn people ahead of time, hey, I'm going with a tank hunter or a tank mage, and I'm going to stick with the ADC in the mid when we start getting into team fights. And generally, if you're going to do this, and when I play this myself, I'll generally skew a bit more towards boosting auras, because you're actually going to be there next to your hunter and your mage. Supports aren't necessarily there with their teammates. They're often making the plays, they're often doing the initiation, so at least some of the time they're not near their allies to give them any auras that they've generated. So in an interesting twist, because you're also ranged, and by nature you're going to be back there with the mages and the hunters, you're just going to be boosting their protections at the same time. I'm more likely to build Sovereignty in this particular circumstance, because it's going to boost the protections of my allies, than I would a lot of other items, right? For this exact reason. I don't personally, and I mentioned this before, I don't personally like Sovereignty too much on Warrior and Assassin solos, but I do happen to actually like it quite a bit for Hunter and Mage solos, because I'm going to be standing next to those allied Hunters and Mages anyways, so why not increase your, defense? And that's generally how that works. For me, anyways. That's all I really have to say about building hunters in the solo lane. Again, they're very straightforward. They pull a lot of notes from, well, I say they pull a lot of notes from mages, but the reverse could also be equally true. But hunters and mages approach solo lane with the same or similar mindsets. It's just that hunters are generally less reliant on the mana buff, and in fact are completely unreliant on it if you happen to build Oboe, if you're fond of that. Some people do, some people don't. I'm not a fan, but that's a personal opinion. Give it a try at the very least, I encourage you. But with that being said, yes, an admittedly very straightforward episode again, but thank you all very much for joining me. If you liked this, please like and subscribe. If you didn't, please ignore me. And, oh, wait, hold on. I actually want to address one final thing. You might be curious, hey, why not build Animosity on a Hunter? Well, quite frankly, you're never going to get the same amount of damage out of Animosity, and it's only 400 HP you're missing. Chin size does more, just passive-wise, it's going to, so I just generally don't go with that. If I were going up against a particularly squishy comp, maybe it's worth thinking about, but then I would lose the incredibly valuable healing from Death's Embrace, so I would have to build something else to replace that. It just becomes very messy. So, now, with that being said, thank you all very much for joining me. If you liked this, please like and subscribe. If you didn't, please ignore me. There we go. And thank you all very much for joining me, and have a great 24 hours.